Hi, I'm Seamless, and today is Thursday, and after some technical difficulties at the beginning of the stream, I'm gonna finally actually be doing this. This is the third part of the making of my Killer Instinct remix, the full title of which is Killer Cuts The Way You Move, SeamlessR Remix. It's a big title, and that makes these video titles even larger. This is the third part, which is gonna be about mixing and mastering, and I'll also cover how I kind of went about doing drums. That's usually how I do these. I put the drums in this last part because a huge part about using drums and things has less to do with sound design and more to do with making everything work with it. So let's actually have a look at these drums I've got. I'll play a bit of the dorp, and then we'll listen to what the drums sound like by themselves. Let your body rock. Yeah. Just a bit, because again, I don't want to get content ID'd. That's what's going on in the hat, or the kick and snare pattern. Here's the hat pattern. If you've seen almost any other electro track I've ever done, this is pretty freaking common, what I'm doing right here. What I've got going on is these two dudes here. My usual setup here is that I have a kick, I have a bunch of snares, but then I kind of pick one of them to be sort of the main deal. I believe I have 3 of them. They all kind of occupy a specific part. I'll talk about my selection process as well in a second. Kick essentially adds up to being kick and snare, and then we have hats. Now the hats do interesting things. So the way that I do hats is that I bust them into 2 different things. I bust them into the main drums bus, which is where all the drums go, and I also bust them into a reverb send, just a hat reverb send. This, you might be thinking, oh, the sends are over here. Well, that's because the sends. Here's the thing about the sends in FL Studio, the actual literal sends, is that they're a legacy. They are there from a day where apparently you couldn't just link anything to anything. So and people made projects using them so that they're there so people can use them. As well, because people who are used to the basic regular mixers setup from regular analog mixers like using sends. The point of a send is that you can put like an effect on it and then route things into the send, you know, more or less all the time. And you can do things like have one reverb effect and one delay and all these things, so that you have like an even and natural sounding thing where everything sounds like it belongs to the same stuff, which is a good idea, but it's not totally necessary for something that it's not trying to be organic, like this track. So I've created my own reverb send over here, and then I'm sidechaining it with a kick. With a kick. And then that's also going into the drums bus. So is all the hats. Hats, all that. Now, the point of doing that is this accomplishes kind of what the same idea of white noise accomplishes in most people's process in writing a track. It adds higher frequency, sort of a washy blendingness behind things, which makes it all sound very much larger and cool. That's the point behind that. Sometimes I'll actually just put the hats all on a bus, reverb it, and then also sidechain it. I'll just sidechain the actual hats. But today, or whenever I made this track a long time ago, I decided I didn't want to do that for some reason. Now, EQ-wise, I don't really do a huge amount of damage on a lot of these things. The only thing that really matters is these 2 non-snares. They're kind of snares, but they're not really kind of snares. Let's talk about the selection process here. So when I picked these 3 snares, I was not... I didn't listen to these 3 things and I thought I needed everything about this. I need everything about this. I need everything about this, and then try to layer them together to get everything about all of them in a way that made sense, because that would be futile. What I did is I didn't. This is actually pretty similar to the idea of how you approach EQing when you don't know what you want in life. The EQing process from when you don't know what you want in life is to grab a node and cut and then kind of scan around until it sounds right. Not until it sounds like a particular kind of filtery weird, but until it stops sounding weird, because it will sound weird when you kind of just filter stuff willy-nilly. So what we're doing is what I do anyway, when I'm trying to pick a snare, is that I'll go find whatever samples I'm using, and then I'll I'll just kind of scan around it until I hear some element about it that fits with whatever I'm going for in my head, which I might know or I might not know. And that element is not going to be the whole thing. In the particular case of these guys, what I was looking for was a snare that had a really tight mid-range, which is invariably any of the 85 snares. Kind of clappy, high frequency stuff that I could control. And then some real, like, just clap centric thing, because again, this is, you know, electro, so that's pretty good. And then blending them all, essentially what I did is I shaped the two non mid-range snares. They were mid-range snares, but I shaped them in such a way that they're being high pass and they're mostly just high frequency snares at this point. And then I kind of left the final snare alone. I, in fact, accentuated the mid-range aspect of it. That's not the right one. That's a harmer. Bam, there it is. It's got plenty of high frequency actually going on in and of itself, but it didn't have enough of the clappy mid-rangey bit. And I feel like forcing it by just like chunking up the EQ to kind of fake the idea. I do that sometimes, but in this particular case, I decided not to. Same kind of deal with the hats. When I'm picking what hat I want, I look for sort of a kit. I want... Okay, well, I appear to have ignored every kind of idea I've ever had about what kind of hats I wanted. Usually what I go for is I get one short hat, one long hat, and then like a ride or something. I guess some of these kind of have a ridey nature to them. But again, I just kind of listen, especially for hats, because they're so, while they're pretty limited in kind of the range of how they can sound, they are also very varied in how they use that sound to kind of sound. So I kind of faked the open hi-hat bit with the reverb. The reverb makes it sound like it's got a real open kind of deal to it. Now, a lot of these decisions were made, like the EQing and crap like that. These are mixing decisions, which is to say I was making them while I was listening to them in context with everything else. Same deal with when I was compressing it with the drums bus. This is pretty regular for pretty much all my tracks. I have a separate sort of drums mini master where I compress them all together using Maximus. And my sort of guiding light for doing this, initially anyway, is that I want every little monitor bit to kind of peak on every band. Now, with the bands that I make split are usually pretty hard cut. Like, and what I mean by that is that they're not actually that hard cut because I'm using nonlinear phase filters, so it's pretty like wide actually. But the mids represent the snare, the hats represent the high end, and the low end represents the kick, kind of thing. Now, you might notice that the low end doesn't peak at 0 dB. And we might be thinking, why do I want to peak at 0 dB? Why not -6? All that, stuff that people like to use. And the reason for that is because it doesn't particularly matter where I have it peaked, just as long as they all peak at somewhere consistent, because then I can just turn down, at the master. You see the kick doesn't peak at 0 dB. In fact, the kick peak is very far away from where the snare is. And this has to do, these were all, again, decisions I made in context with everything else. Probably what happened is that I shortened the kick. It appears to be almost normal. Yeah, it's pretty normal. I must have just turned it down when it was too much in the master. The master compression process is actually pretty similar to the process I used when I was doing the drums master, because again, I have it representing the kick and the snare and the hats, because those are all going to be the loudest and most disruptive elements in your track. Now, this is the drums bus. I'm just going to label it drums. The three main buses in here are the drums, the sub, and the sidechain.
Let your body rock. Let your body move. Let your body jump.
That's where literally everything that's not drums goes. I think even the vocals are going in here. It might not be, though. Nope, they're going in there. Oh, they're going in here, which is going in the master. So they're actually not going in there. Oh, they are going in there. They're parallel. That's something you can do. I have HQ off. HQ off. I have HQ off. I remember where my camera is. the reason why I brought this up, so the way I do sidechaining, okay, is that I have a sidechain bus. The way the vocals are handled is actually a wonderful example of this. An example. I have a sidechain bus, and then it's all being sidechained.
Let your body rock.
By, the kick. Straightforward stuff. Most higher level producers will tell you that instead of doing precisely what I'm doing, is that you want to actually individually sidechain everything. Well, through the method that I've chosen to do here, you actually can still do that. In a sense, it's not directly comparable to doing it all manually. And sometimes I do it all manually. And by sometimes I mean it once. Like in the case of the vocals, what happens here is I'm running it into the sidechain channel and the master, both kind of pulled off a bit. So that means that a portion of the signal is being sidechained, another portion is not. This is technically a parallel compression since I'm doing this with the limiter. And the reason why this works is because in the limiter, I have the attack all the way off. If you ever see me do things, you notice that whenever I open up the limiter, the first thing I do is I turn the ceiling all the way up and I turn the attack all the way off. This attack is actually a look-ahead delay. Never mind that this says ahead. This is what this attack does on the limit side. So that means that it delays the audio. So you turn it off, it doesn't delay the audio. Go to compression and do your thing. Put on an EQ to high pass everything, kind of. And I have a little bit of low end because I do like the low end in some of the sounds I make. I turn off HQ mode, which reduces the amount of latency that comes out of the EQ, to the point where I can run things in parallel to the sidechain in the master, and there won't be phasing. I don't have pre-computed delay, do I? No, I do not. Plug-in delay compensation. That's a whole universe of stuff that eventually I might talk about in a tutorial, but it's suffice to say it's a thing I never use. But somehow it's on for some of my tracks. Like, I don't know what I remember doing that. Yeah. So by doing that, you're able to kind of control its level of sidechain. It'll still be the same sidechain profile. It'll still be the same attack and release and whatever that you're setting in the limiter, but it's just the amount will be different, which is pretty good. For me personally, I use sidechaining as a mixing tool, not so much as a stylistic effect, although it comes off as a stylistic effect. It's primarily a mixing tool in the sense that I'm using the actual kick as the sidechain source to the track, as opposed to when, like for example, I was doing that Cohen sounding thing on one of the sound design researches, and I sidechained ghost kicks, and I had radically different sidechain profiles from what the actual kick and snare were doing. Those are more stylistic than mixing, but they still involve mixing ideas. And the reason that this makes sense is because if I have the vocals in there, the vocals are lead elements. I don't necessarily want them to be sidechained as hard as, say, the chords, but I do still want them to be sidechained so that the kick has some ducking involved, so the high end of the kick doesn't really interfere with the high end of the vocals. But you still don't want them to be so disrupted that they sound all wavy and weird. That just is not something you want to do with vocals most of the time. If you want to be stylistic about it, you can. But because we're fitting it directly to the kick, it makes a nice hole. It's pretty much the size of the kick and nothing more, and it works out pretty okay. Now, people in the past have pointed out that if I do this whole double sidechain routing thing, that it's not technically blending sidechain and not sidechain, because what's happening is that we have the not sidechain level and the sidechain level, and then it's just making it louder on top. This is why I turn it down halfway, and then it's bringing it down, and it's going down the regular level, and that kind of thing. And they're right about that. But the thing is that the way that things behave under compression, because remember, I have my master chain engaged, the things that happen going into compression means that you have, what was I talking about? Leveling compression, right? So imagine you have two things going into your compression. They're both equally loud. They're both equally louder than like their threshold. So they're going to get equally brought down. If you turn one of them down at the level stage, what's going to happen is that it's still going to, be involved in a compressive up like that. So what's going to happen is that it's not going to sound like this thing gets quieter. This thing is going to sound like it gets louder. So that's the behavior that you have to expect when you're leveling things under compression. This is the same thing that applies to the sidechaining thing. So it actually does work out to be what I want it to be, which is a blend between sidechain and non-sidechained audio. So I can control at least the depth and threshold of something being sidechained by basically creating a sidechain floor by also routing it to the master. That's the whole point of that. So in this sense, I'm able to have a single sidechain bus, but still have different sidechain settings and anything that's running into it. It's a pretty cool deal. What am I talking about? Yeah, so relatively straightforward stuff there. Now the sub. I have a sub. I have a separate sub. This is something I don't do very often.
Let your body rock.
Right there, you can actually see the amount of things that are going through the sidechain and also the master because I turned sidechain off.
Let your body rock.
I also put the that tribal like percussive bass through the sidechain and also not the sidechain because I wanted to be more prevalent. That's one way of making things more prevalent is that they're not being run through the sidechain. Now, the way that the separate sub works is interesting, especially for this track, because the idea of the sub, of having a separate sub, is that you want it to follow your bass and your melodies and all this stuff underneath everything, so that it's all consistent and smooth, and you don't have to worry about weird low end from any weird processes you might have applied to your basses, like I do, like resampling and lots of EQ modulation and things that can kind of convolute the note. You don't really want to keep that in the low end. It makes it muddy. So you replace it with a separate sub. And thinking about this works out pretty okay for stuff like the basses you can see here, and like, you know, it adds up to being things that work. I like to go for a smooth bass beneath the tribal thing, the percussive element. It was too fast to really notice that we're doing a different hit for the kind of sub that I used anyway. But for the actual resampled elements, like this guy, that was just a guess, a huge guess as to what the notes were doing. And it's because I don't know what's happening in there. And even if I did know the actual MIDI value, it's probably not exactly that anyway. So, and that's pretty much true for all of them. All of the rendered audio based parts. But that ends up working out okay because the whole point of the separate sub is that it doesn't really matter what's going on above it. It'll still be kind of what the bass is doing. So that pretty much works out. This is being sidechained separately. It doesn't go to the sidechain sub. It be sidechained and like that click at the beginning there. That's what happens when you sidechain without attack. That's okay though because, you know, it happens whenever there's a kick transient, so it actually kind of adds to stuff. It's pretty nice. These three buses combined go into the master. Now, all the individual other things we've actually basically covered in the sound design and element arrangement, stuff like that. I mentioned this before when we can look at the vocals because that's probably the part I didn't mention. But we can look at, we mentioned before that there's two kinds of stages to mixing things, like to using EQ and stuff on a sound, or compression for that matter. There's sound design and then there's mixing. Sound design is where you are changing things to make the sound as good as possible by itself. And mixing is where you're changing things to make it sound as good as possible relative to everything else. These decisions, you know, I'm making them when I'm building the sound. I'll you know, move stuff around as I think it needs to sound, and then that's how I want the sound to sound. That's its tone now. That's how the sound sounds. And then the second you layer that with something else, the frequencies are going to conflict, and it's going to color how that sound sounds. The tone is going to be different. So then you have to make mixing changes on either the new conflicting elements or your original sound to make it sound like the original tone you had in mind when it's with everything else. That's mixing. That's mixing 101. That's what you do. And just for the sake of people who are new, and also for if people haven't seen me talk about this before, I actually went over it already. I went over how the EQ when you don't know what you're doing, the grab a node and scan thing. Like okay, I'll give you a practical example because that's probably smart. Practical example would be the chord and bass combo I got going on here. All right, so I've got a chord and I've got a bass. Now, these are two things that I designed to go together. They're designed to be played together pretty much all the time. Sometimes the bass is played by itself, but most of the time it's played with that chord. So how do I make this sound? You can see there's this weird EQ curve here. And this guy, you can see even weirder stuff. Now, a lot of the mixing decisions that I made, like this, for example, this cut and this cut, were made in context to everything else about all the other stuff. They just happen to be in the same place. It's a pretty regular common thing. And then also the high end, I pumped up, probably because when I put them against the hats, it didn't sound, they sounded much darker in comparison, because everything sounds dark in comparison to hats. So I pumped up a little bit. Alternatively, I could have brought down the hats, but I didn't want to. This cut was definitely a sound design based one. Just did kind of whatever I wanted to do. But the way that this would happen, like if I didn't have this EQ at all, the way this works is that you take the sound and you make it sound as awesome as you want. Like right now, it kind of sounds like it, because we're used to the sound now. We need to kind of have it higher. But that's how I want it to sound, right? This is how I want this bass to sound. Then I layer it with this guy, but it's still, there's something wrong with it. It doesn't sound quite right. I mean, I know the answer is to get rid of it down here, but let's pretend I don't know what that answer is. So like if I'm not totally sure what the answer is, what I do is I take a node, I play it, and I scan around with the node. Now you might have noticed, pretty much except for when I got over here, that pretty much forever it had that weird kind of phasey notch sounding filter effect to it. And that's because it's moving, obviously. And you might be thinking, well, you have to kind of make it stand still and make it see if it sounds right. And you can do that if you want to, but really what ends up happening is that if there is actually a solution to this by cutting, the second you get past it, it'll sound right for a second. It won't sound phasing. It won't sound filtery. It'll sound as if you're just bypassing it for a second, that you stop doing it. And that's where you want to make your cut. And for me, that was like over here somewhere. And then I did that. So that's how, and like the reason why I'm doing this with in context with the chords, right? Because I wanted it to sound right with the chords. It's a chord-based combo. So like I originally designed the bass to sound pretty much like that by itself. And then when I layered it in with the chords, the higher frequencies of the chords, the 2K area, the 2 to 5K area, like the mid range, that kind of thing, all layered together with the bass I made to make the bass sound weird. Same as well when I made the chords sounded the way they do by themselves, and then they don't when the bass is layered with it. So you have to fix them. That was the idea there. Now, that was pretty much done everywhere. Now, vocals are interesting. They're a little daunting, but they're also kind of easy, depending on the vocal. So, like, I have my vocal in here.
Let your body rock.
Here being sidechained. So this was easy for interesting reasons, and then the higher vocals were easy for another reason. These were easy because they are not tonal. They're a little tonal. I'm kind of singing the tune, but it's not really a tune. And this means that they're gonna clash, but that's intentional. That's their point in life.
Let your body rock.
So in general, you know, a good idea is to kind of like lay it back on the low end, and I basically just used the master compressor, Maximus compressor here as a de-esser. That's what the setup is. I think I went over that in sound design.
Let your body rock.
There's a comfortable amount of low end going on in there, and I pump up a bit of it in Maximus. And the rest of it is just pushing up the sibilant area, which is I'm able to do because I de-ess the hell out of it. And the point of doing that is because that's what ends up cutting.
Let your body rock.
We hear the sibilant, the high frequency stuff a lot better against everything else than we do the lower stuff. And it's because there's a huge amount of lower stuff happening, you know, the way that it works out. Do I even smiley curve? Yeah. That's it. Some of the chat was talking about the whole boost the lows, boost the highs, cut the mids. That's just a pretty common sort of mixing curve for some things sometimes.
Let your body rock.
Quite. So kind of putting it in there, I basically just put on top of stuff, and it just sort of worked out. And the reason why it worked out is because of a lot of compression on the master. But we'll get to that. With the female vocals, these were super easy because they're high frequency. super high frequency. And look at that. There are no frequencies below 500 hertz in here. Like, here's the thing. Here's the thing about high frequencies. Like, lower frequency sounds require more power to sound as high as higher frequency sounds. Like, if you left channel made like a 1K hertz sine, and then right channel made a 200 hertz sine, or like a 150, a bass, just a bass sine, and you level them to the point where they sounded even to you on either side, and then you looked at the peaking value in whatever you level them in, you would notice that the low end had to be huge to compare with the high frequency sounds. This is just the way it is, and this has to do with physics of how speakers react and how much air moves and that kind of thing. But as a result, this means that we hear high frequency sounds a lot clearer, even if they're a lot quieter, which means above 1K, we have a lot of headroom, just a huge amount of headroom, which means if we're using really high frequency vocals, chances are you can just kind of slap them in there without really having to do a huge amount of correction to things. You're going to have to mix them, obviously, like I was doing here. You're going to have to mix other stuff to make it work with it. But like levels and headroom wise, you're not going to have to worry about a bunch. Like I'd already basically mixed and mastered this track by the time I got the vocals. And I put the vocals on and I really only had to do minor mixing things. I didn't have to alter the master almost at all, because while being fairly impactful and a big centerpiece of the whole thing, it's not very loud in terms of levels because it's high frequency. That's very nice. Well, people actually understand that. People in the chat are mentioning the curve theory. I don't know any of that. I never studied any of this beyond my own personal observations. Yeah, they're saying that people often mixed to pick pink noise to get a flat frequency response. Pink noise being even distribution of frequencies across all frequencies. Even distribution of levels across all frequencies. As opposed to white noise, which is angled to the higher frequencies to make it sound higher. So that's what pink noise is. I don't do that. There's a lot of reasons why I don't do that. Yeah, so like I said, I pretty much had this already done. So like when I got the vocals and I put them in there, that was when I'm starting to make my actual final considerations for what the master is on this track. Do I even smiley curve? This isn't exactly the smiley curve, but this is actually one of the most extreme master EQs I have on anything. And you might have noticed that like on almost everything, I kind of cut 2K and 5K, and then up here I am pumping it up. The 2K, 5K thing is usually a sound designer thing that I do, just because on my system, it's apparently way too high already. And so I overcompensate for it and I get rid of it, and it's a big deal. But I referenced the hell out of I forget what track. I think a Madian track. This feels like a pretty Madian-y thing. But I did reference, because this is fucking Killer Instinct OST that I'm doing this track for, so I'm trying not to fuck up. And actually, hilariously, Mick Gordon asked me to give him a pre-master. He actually wanted me to give him a pre-master, so that he could master it, and I wouldn't have to worry about any of it. I'm like, okay, cool, yeah, I'll give you a pre-master, and he did, and he said that he actually liked my master better afterwards. And that might be a little bit my fault, because if you remember anything about me at all, my pre-masters are janky shit. So that probably could have worked out better, but there was a time crunch, so he didn't want to, do revisions, so he wanted me to just do my master. What else? So I reference a lot of stuff, and I do tend to notice that things represent themselves pretty heavily in 2K and 5K on my system, so I represented it just as hard so that it is comparable with everything else. Same with kind of like the 200 hertz range kind of thing. Like I referenced a lot of stuff to make sure that I wasn't overcompensating for things on this particular track. So that's what this this shit is. Now, as for the final actual master, there's only really two real utilitarian things that I do with the master compression. And by utilitarian, I mean things that I do on every track, or at least things that I try to accomplish in every track.
Let your body rock.
I evidently didn't do that first one I was thinking about in the bass here. This is pretty much a wonderful example of not having dynamic range, which a lot of people hate me for. I guess I started doing this after I made this track, but what I've essentially done here is I've crunched the bass up so that everything's at the same level, including the kick. You might be thinking, well, if the kick's exactly the same level as the sub before, then there's no dynamic range and the impact is lost, and you're right. And the only reason why there's any impact at all is because of the incredibly huge sidechaining. In fact, you remember when we're looking at the sub by itself. That's why there's impact.
Let your body move. Let your body jump.
So yes, mids and highs are pumped up a little bit, but it's not really a huge amount that I'm doing to it. The mix that I do into this works out well enough that I tend not to have to do actual compression on mids and highs. I use this basically as kind of a really broad EQ. Then the master. So here's the other utility that I utilize. This is soft saturation.
Let your body rock.
Man, despite not doing a thing in the bass, there's actually kind of a tremendous amount of dynamic range in my on the master and in the pre-master. The pre-master is basically what you're seeing going on up here before it goes into the master. And these peaks are kind of just around and whatever. And the idea of master limiting, brick wall sort of master limiting, is that when you get to this point, you're supposed to have a really well-fitting, super great, like, mixed well pre-mix. And then there's just a minor, like maybe 1 or 2 dB peaks that are just kind of floating around. And then you can get rid of them. You can just crush those and it'll be fine. And it'll sound a little bit louder and everyone's fine. But like, as you can see, my peaks are like anywhere from 9 to 6 dB above 0, or above average, because you can actually see the peaks go below 0 dB kind of a lot, which is a little different for my taste, for my usualness. Although, again, this is a big old official actual release on a relatively popular game OST, so I guess I was trying to not be stupid about it. Because I mean, I know what I like, and I know that not a lot of people like what I like. So I have to kind of make that decision. Even though he said, make it a seamless track, make it as seamless as possible. And it is pretty seamlessy to just fuck everyone's ears. But I had a heart. And it was ripped out by Orchid. So the way that soft saturation works is that it's essentially distortion.
Let your body rock. Let your body.
Note that when I brought it down, not only did it get quieter, but it also got really heavily obviously distorted. And that's the key word here, is obviously distorted. Because what it's doing is it's distorting it. It's such a clipping, but it's algorithmic clipping. As opposed to procedural clipping, where you're rendering it, and because of the render, it clips, and you're sending perfectly cut square waves into a speaker cone, which every single system was going to react to differently. So that is 100% impossible to truly, for real, master. But algorithmic clipping is just one step shy of that, which means that speaker cones can appropriately recreate it, and it will sound pretty much natural. Well, it will sound the way you want it to sound and everything, provided you do it right. And by right, I mean you don't push it too hard above the whatever the ceiling is. Now, the reason why this works at all is because pretty much every sound that I've got going on here is distorted already. So this means that adding a little bit of extra high frequency activity, which is what distortion does, is not so detrimental. Not even when I have vocals going on, which are usually the thing that suffers the most from this, because the second there's even a little bit of it above 0 dB, like it usually cackles and crunches in ways that are bad. But because there's like super saws everywhere, basses, crunchy basses, hats, it's hiding the fact that there's a little bit of distortion going on. if I try doing this with like a liquid drum and bass track or some like deep house or whatever, the second it even looked at 0 dB in the wrong way, it would sound like I scratched a needle or something. It's just awful. So that's why that works. But I don't want to, like I said, it's about not pushing it too far above the thresholds. That's why I'm also including a little bit of actual compression. And so this means that I'm getting kind of the best of both worlds. Because if I were to compress this thing totally with the amount that I'm pushing it above 0 dB, I would have the usual compression artifacts. In fact, I'll just show you what that sounds like.
Let your body rock. Let your body move. Let your body jump. Let your body rock. Let your body move to the killer groove.
If I don't get content ID'd for that, someone's looking out for me. So the difference that was pretty much really clear there was that the sharpness went away when I was compressing it for real. I mean, I didn't change any of the time variables or compression settings, so there's something to be said about that. But when I first discovered what soft saturation did, like I didn't know what it did. I just knew that it cut everything off of the ceiling, and it actually is not designed to do this, but it does. And I referred to it as free compression, not particularly knowing things about the high frequency stuff and distortion or whatever. And I call it free compression because it essentially brick walls in a particular location and seemingly doesn't kill anything. Like you notice how the typical compression artifacts are that it gets all muddy and weird and just not definitive, not definable. And like you do with soft saturation the way that I described, it suddenly doesn't. It's still being cut at 0 dB, but it's nice and loud still. And it's because of the distortion. But so if you push it too far above 0 dB above the threshold for the soft saturation, it gets too distorted. You push it too far above whatever your ratio and threshold settings for the compression are, it gets too compressy. So I'm doing a little bit of both to get the best of both worlds and avoid the artifacting of either. So worth noting in Maximus, I just mentioned the threshold and ratio, despite there not being any obvious threshold and ratio knob. I am creating the threshold and ratio manually by actually moving around the graph. So based on what I've done here, this is a ratio of a threshold of 0 dB and a ratio of like not quite 2 to 1. This would be 2 to 1. This would be like 1.06 to 1. And this is the angle that is essentially would be created by doing the ratio yourself manually. Although you can do a lot cooler things with it. This is pretty basic stuff that you do for master stuff. You don't really want to do crazy weird curve stuff on the actual master unless you're doing crazy weird stuff. This isn't crazy weird stuff. This is actually pretty regular normal stuff. So yeah. Anyway, I talked about that pretty quickly, but this is like I said, this is rather common for how I mix and master pretty much every track. As far as getting to this point, I described this in the mastering production basics on my channel, which I really hated making. But the way that this works is that when I first made this track, I began with the intro actually, because I had a template to work with. This being a remix. I wonder how long this track took me. 24 hours. That's pretty reasonable. I had a remix. It was a remix, so I pretty much had the layout. I had the progressions and the melody. There wasn't really a melody. I had all that to go. I guess it was a melody, but like it meant that I didn't have to actually start with the drop and kind of like extrapolate what the intro be and all that kind of stuff. But I still didn't make the master until I made the drop. I made like the first phrase like I normally do, and then I mixed and mastered pretty much from here to here, as if it were done. I just straight up mixed and mastered it until that part sounded perfect, and then I made everything else after that with the master compression on the entire time. This does not mean that I mix at full volume, and I don't recommend that you ever mix at full volume, especially if you're not doing what I do with the compression, because I think it's actually worse if you're mixing a full volume with an uncompressed pre-master and you have all this humongous dynamic range and you're pumping it up and you're getting punched in the face with higher SPL than you're used to. And I not particularly well recommend that. It took me kind of a while to get out the habit, but I do actually mix at reasonable levels now. And it does help. It does help. So Yeah, mixing with the master on, so I know how everything sounds, I know how everything works, and I'm also making the mix to fit with the master perfectly because I'm looking at what's happening in real time. This isn't necessary. You don't need to do that, but it's just the way that I do it because I like it and I can. Which is mostly an opinion, I suppose. I mean, I like it and I can are totally facts, but it's an opinion that I would say is valuable for anyone else to even attempt. I'm trying to think if I meant, oh yeah. So the basic layout is that I have a sidechain bus where all the non-drum elements go. I have a bus for where all the drums go. And then I have a separate sub, which is separate from everything and being sidechained by itself. And then all of that goes in the master. It's being crushed together with the force of God, and it's becoming louds. I'm technical. I'm a professional. I actually am a professional. Jesus Christ. Yeah. Well, the actual recording we're pretty much done. So let's actually have questions from the chat. Someone asked in the chat, "What's SPL?" SPL is sound pressure level. It's usually measured for things like jet engines and kick drums and crap like that. What is love? Getting more content. ID'd today. No questions? No kind of questions? Let's see. Shrek is love. Baby, don't hurt me. What's Ebola? It's a virus. What is transient recovery? Okay, well, give me a second. Let's first talk about what a transient is. Transient, actually we can zoom in on something. I mean, the transient is essentially this. What's going on here? There's impact transients like this guy, which you can see has a bunch. It's really just the shape of the volume metering of a sound that's happening. There's a more complicated explanation of what this is, but practically this is what this is. Like, I'm going to keep talking about this hardstyle thing because when I was looking into the hardest sound design ever, I noticed that they broke some stuff up into interesting categories. They broke it up and they broke it up in terms of this quote unquote transient, this weird midsection, and then this note, and then a tail, and then they would have different samples and different settings, different effect chains for all of these things. And then this is the one that would have note value changes. This is still, like, in a very technical sense, these are all still transients, but like the thing that people care about when they say transients are these things. The impact and beginning of a sound that has impact. Now, we can see this happening. For example, if we look at the drums bus. Here is the kick and snare transient. That's what that is. Now, transient shaping and transient recovery are all about controlling the attack and release and decay and crap of all these things. And that's actually still just compression. Like, watch what happens when I turn on the master compression in here. And let's see, like, let's screw with the transients here. Just,
Let your body rock. Let your body move. Let your body jump. Let your body rock.
This is why I didn't do that, but this is basically what happens here. So what I've done is I have increased the sort of the transient sharpness of these sounds by reducing the amount of decay there is. And alternatively, I can expand it, like the transient. So now the transient's still pretty much still there the way it is, but then the tail is now huge. And so like what I've just done there is transient shaping. If you ever see a transient shaper discuss, like telling us what it's doing, then like that's basically what it does. It's not, I mean, there's a lot of algorithms about things. Like, for example, I just kind of willy-nilly did it on just the snare and it kind of fucked with the kick. But, like, you know, transient shaper is a little smarter than that. And you could be a little smarter than that, too, if you want to do it manually, but I don't necessarily recommend it. So transient recovery would be if I compressed everything to a point where there really wasn't transients anymore.
Let your body rock.
As you can see, that's the sound that we're hearing is the result of there not being well-defined transients. Because it's just this big old trapezoid now, and that's not a very sharp sounding thing. Despite there being the attack is still there, and then there's still this hit, but it's a result of
Let your
how the compression works that this is destroying there being any attack, there being any real sharpness to something. So transient recovery would be fixing that. And there's actually a lot of ways you can do this with compression. Like the easiest one would be to add attack to your compression so that like it takes it a second to turn on. Attack wouldn't do that on the master EQ, on the master band on Maximus. I think if I did this, not quite, not so much. She made it worse. But in regular compressors, it's kind of how you would do that. Don't do that on the master. Don't ever do this on the master. You can in Maximus do this on the bands where like on the high example, the high frequencies here. Fucking with my mix.
let your body rock.
So here I've just ruined the high frequencies. But if I increase the attack,
Let your
you can see. Okay, you can look right there. You see the purple. Purple is the original input. Beige is the output. Now, because I have increased the attack pretty heavily, the compression is delayed after the actual hit happens, which means the hit actual transient is still there now. So we've kind of recovered the transients a bit. You might be thinking, well, okay, I thought transient recovery was actually like a special process. It's just a different way of applying compression, such to account for transients. Same thing with transient shapers. Same thing with pretty much anything that has the word transient in it. It's mostly just compression. Yeah, I'm gonna undo the shit out of that.
let your body rock.
Doesn't matter. It's already out and saved and stuff like that. So I think I'm not destroying anything. Is it really necessary to get your track redlining? There are lots of great tracks out there which you had to turn up your music the tiniest amount. Plus, if you have airtime on the radio, they compress the track even more. So let's talk about. I actually didn't talk about this yet, but let's talk about redlining. So in FL anyway.
Let your body rock.
You can see that there's actually quite a few mixer inserts that are going above 0 dB, pretty a lot. Like it's redlining, it's clipping, quote unquote, because it's not actually clipping. This is because FL doesn't run internally at 16-bit or 24-bit depth. It runs at 32-bit depth, not x86 32-bit audio, 32-bit depth. And it means a lot of things, but what this particularly means is that 0 dB doesn't give a shit. It's going to go above 0 dB, and it's going to stay above 0 dB, and it's not going to actually remove anything. As long as at the very last second in the very last end master limiter, everything is brought down below 0 dB. It doesn't matter what's happening in the mixer before that, it will still have the peaks and the information that you have present there. It's not actually being distorted. Really, like the concept of dB is not an arbitrary measurement. Like it's very much just sound levels, that kind of thing. But you might be wondering, why the hell do we call anything 0 dB and we have plus or minus dB? What the hell's up with that? Where 0 dB is and how loud it is 100% just a standard, and it just tells you how far or above or away the particular limit for whatever playback device that you're using is. Because people can turn down and up the music, right? They can turn up and down. So like if you're plus 6 dB on your room or whatever, and then someone turns it down and they're now plus 3 on theirs, so what does that mean? It's all relative. So using 0 dB as just a standard is essentially what's happening. The idea that I'm like, okay, let's move everything, let's line everything up to 0 dB. It's whatever. If I mastered stuff to 6 dB, like if I did literally everything I've done here, or like minus 6 dB rather, and made minus 6 dB the standard, and I got brickwalled it to that, and then I turned it up, it would sound almost identical. I say almost because you would get some artifacts from bit crushing essentially, but but beyond that, there would be almost no change because I just essentially made minus 6 dB the new 0 dB, and then up and down and beyond that is just relative. And like the crux of the question that the guy asked was that why do we care about loudness really? Because he's saying to get more loud on the radio, is it really necessary to redline everything? And the short answer to that is no, you don't need to. But there's this really kind of unfortunate niggle about human psychology, which is that louder things, even if they're identical sources, the louder ones will sound better to us. We'll interpret them as being better. There's nothing we can do about that. It just does. Professionals can make inferences and differences, and audiophiles can make inferences and differences, but they are such a small minority when it comes to actual music consumers. So this means we kind of have to plan for that really unfortunate bit of human psychology. And as a result of that human psychology bit and just my own personal sensibilities, I like loud shit. I like it a lot. And I get mad if I listen to my music and then I go listen to like a Skrillex track and it's loud as fuck. And I'm just like, damn it, I want to be loud. And so I try really hard. Now I am. That's really all there is to that. There have been so many studies where people have shown that like music is objectively better when it has more dynamic range. And for a lot of genres, not only is that just like a psychological truth, it's also a necessity. Like for your average movie soundtrack, classical stuff, particular kinds of hip hop and things like that, dynamic range is your friend. But for this stuff, and a lot of I should have made this disclaimer, I might have, for the mastering production basics, is that these genres really the style about how they sound is heavily the result of loudness war processing. Like it colors the stuff in a way that has a particular kind of compressed sound to it that is what the genre sounds like. And if you don't do it, if you have like a nice, full of dynamic range, uncompressed mix of like this track, there's no way it's going to sound as good to me as this crushed as hell super track. And not just because I made this track, not just because I like louder stuff, but because it will sound wrong. Like the style just won't work. Even if I never heard it before, it just wouldn't make sense. It would sound like a cover. It would sound like a weird, like acoustic band cover of like a track like this, which just sounds just odd. And that's just conditioning, how that works out. SeamlessR, do you use a lot of plugins, right? Not necessary. I mean, you can kind of see all the plugins I'm using. Like this is not doing anything, this guy here. On the master anyway, I use 2 plugins. I use an EQ and a compressor. This is a multi-band compressor kind of deal. You could probably accomplish this with like an ozone. Ozone is not as versatile as Maximus in my own personal opinion, but that's, it has an EQ in it is what I'm saying. And pretty much all the mixing aspects, I have either an EQ or like a reverb or something. I don't really use a lot. And if I do use a lot, it's usually like I usually put on a patcher and then I'll just use a lot of the regular stuff. As far as the actual synths I'm using, you can see I use all Harmers and 1 Citrus. I don't think Serum was out when I was finishing this track. Okay, here's someone else actually asked a reasonable question. When it's necessary to brick wall like hell, why does deadmau5 tracks sound so good despite having like dynamic range as hell? Here's the thing about deadmau5 stuff. And, like, think about this, really. Like, think about what my track sounds like.
Let your body rock.
Or like a Madian track, and then imagine any deadmau5 track. The first thing you should think of is not so much that there's dynamic range in deadmau5 tracks, but that there's almost nothing happening in deadmau's tracks in comparison to this track or Madian tracks. That's just a stylistic difference. We have more going on in our tracks, which necessarily means that we have less headroom because there's more shit in our tracks. If you don't have as much shit in your tracks, it's a lot easier to have more headroom and make things louder. Like, that's really all there is to that. That's really all there is to that. And I mean, Steve Duda was talking to me about how deadmau5 used to do his stuff. I don't think he still does, but like he pretty much only levels things. Like he'd have the kicks and the synths and the everything else he's using, and he'd only ever level them. He didn't really do a huge amount of EQing and stuff like that because he'd synthesize them all enough to sound the way he wanted them to. This is kind of like how when people talk about guitar recording, they tell you, the professional, super ultra traditional engineers will tell you not to EQ your guitars. But if you want to make an EQ change, move the microphone in relative to the cabinet because that will effectively EQ the guitar. That's something that that's certainly just what's up with that kind of thing. And so he only levels, there's not a lot going on, and then he doesn't compress very hard. Like if you think about how loud, for example, the kick is by itself in this track, Like when it's by itself, it's coming out at 0 dB because it's being compressed all the way up.
Let your body rock.
And the fact that it sounds almost as loud when everything else is playing it together is mostly a trick and the result of the sidechaining. But when it's by itself, it sounds almost too loud. And I'm sure you've had this situation where like you open up a plugin like Harmor, you open up a Harmor and it's the saw wave, regular saw wave, and you play a note and it's too loud. It's like forcefully too loud. And it has not much to do with the fact that you haven't EQ'd it at all or anything like that, but by itself, it's solid and it's there's no competition for it. And it's not convoluted with like effects or anything. So it's the clearest, most pure representation of Fourier harmonic content, and it's loud as shit. And then you look at like the level and it's like not even that loud. It's not 0 dB or anything. It's like minus 6 dB and it still sounds too loud. That's the power of having like simple low level sound design for stuff. I'm not saying that deadmau5 sound design is simple because he has done things that stump me, but most of the time he utilizes really simple, not complicated stuff, which makes it a lot easier for them all to individually sound a hell of a lot louder than everything else. That's pretty much it. So RMS. I don't measure RMS. I just don't. Someone I trusted on the matter a long time ago told me that it was kind of bullshit. And I just sort of took it to heart. I never had to care. There was never anything about what I'm doing that felt lacking to the point where I had to go out and find some other metering measurement to determine how loud stuff was. There are others as well, not just RMS and then peak level, which is what I'm doing here. There's some other kind of mastering algorithm. It's a bunch of numbers and stuff that measures loudness. That's supposedly better, but I'm not a mastering engineer, so I don't know what the hell that is. What is redline? Redlining is when you're going above 0 dB, and usually a metering playback thing will go into the red, so you're redlining. Talk about what headroom is. Headroom is basically the distance between your loudest element and the maximum loudness you can have, which is not necessarily how loud things are. So basically your highest peak to 0 dB, like how much room you got there. Yeah. Okay, that was a pretty reasonable amount of information and questions to have answered. For those watching on YouTube, if you have any questions about any of this, let me know. And also, you might be seeing all this overlay stuff and seeing what's going on. If you don't know about this, I'm streaming on Twitch a lot. Every weekday, actually, except tonight because I'm going to see Skrillex. But my schedule is 10 a.m. to noon EST and then 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. EST. It's just so I can kind of hit both kind of halves of the worlds in terms of time zones. I know I'm missing some people. I know it's not going to work out for everybody, but it's going to work out for a hell of a lot more if I just picked either or. So it's about 2 hours each. I might actually extend the evening one to 8 p.m. to 11. Just because every time I've done it so far, I've basically done that anyway. So I might just make it official. But yeah, if you have any questions about any of all that, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.